Susan, the recording has started, so feel free to jump in.
All right, thank you, Corey. I'm Susan Urban with NELLCO, and we are really happy to have everyone here for Data Visualizations Part 1. This is a joint collaboration with LIPA, NELLCO, and NELLCO, and our presenter today is Amanda Karel. Let me pull up her bio real quick, and I will give her a little introduction and let her get going. Amanda is the project manager for NELLCO Law Library Consortium. She works on the All-Star benchmarking project and specializes in data collection, analysis, assessment, and surveying. She served as the strategic planning project manager for the University of Washington School of Law and is the co-owner of AKR Consulting. And she has extensive experience with assessment and data visualization. So I will turn it over to Amanda and let her get going.
Hello all, and thank you so much for joining, and Susan, for that introduction. I'm really excited to start this conversation about finding ways to create meaningful data visualizations. This is something that has crept into my life, and it has slowly taken over as my career has changed over the years. So before we really get started today, I really want to take a minute to acknowledge that this is essentially an amuse-bouche at best of the world of data visualization. There is so much we could talk about, and I don't even dare call it an appetizer. There is a really robust literature around data visualization by itself. So then when you start expanding the scope, you can really start looking at ideas like data storytelling, which rests on the literature of conducting research, evaluation, and assessment in general, and within specific contexts like higher ed, which is the path I was taking that led me down this fun rabbit hole of exploring more about data viz. I also want to mention today that the principles and types of visualizations that we are talking about are ironically not appropriate for academic writing. While I am less confident about what, if any, guidelines Blue Book has for data visualizations, other academic traditions, particularly those that follow APA format, have really strict parameters under which you must work to give a visualization. So that has led me to have to unlearn a lot of things that have been drilled into my head since I was 17. So now I'm almost at the point where I can code switch, so to speak, depending on where my visuals are going to land. So just keep this in mind, that the visuals that we're talking about today are intended more for presentations or reports and are very different than what you would probably want to put in a journal article, depending on the journal. So as the introduction mentioned, I have been working in different contexts within these areas for well over a decade now. And when I tell people what I get to do for a living, I get the impression that this is the image that comes to mind. And while there is truly an element of truth to that, I really do love to nerd out with data. That's part of why my career has been in academia, and my Instagram feed is now full of Excel tips. It really is about more than just numbers. For me, I like to figure out the story behind the data, be it quantitative or qualitative data, and really figure out what insights and lessons can be gained from looking at that data. So for me, I feel like this is a more accurate illustration of who I am. The reason being is I love to make plans and figure out how to move forward. And this applies to any situation, from relationships with the people I like and love to working with law libraries and law schools, which I also happen to like and love. I can actually hear my friends, spouse, colleagues start to roll their eyes every time I say, well, that's data, in response to something that happens. And that rolling of their eyes is in fact also data. And I'm hooked on data because of this old adage that wisdom is built on knowledge, and knowledge is underpinned by information, and data is the building block for information. But I also really like how Caroline Carruthers and Peter Jackson problematized this idea a little bit in their book, The Chief Data Officer's Playbook, that information isn't really the correct label here. And I am inclined to agree. Carruthers and Jackson argue that this layer should be called CCC data for data that is collected, curated, and contextualized. Because it's really those three actions, collecting, curating, and contextualizing data, that lets you find value in raw data. It is those three actions that have given me the knowledge to make fun of myself for always saying that's data. I've also noticed that there is a pattern of people rolling their eyes when I say that's data. That's occurred because I collect and mentally log the way that raw data of reactions has played out. I've analyzed and curated that data to figure out the patterns and how often eye rolls occur, when they do, when they don't, what context do I want that eye roll, what context do I not. And unfortunately, for my spouse at least, this hasn't quite given me the wisdom to know when not to say this phrase, but it has given me the knowledge about how I can use that phrase. And so while my brain is quite analytical, what actually lets me move through these phases of moving from data to wisdom, sometimes in order, sometimes going back and forth a few times, it's actually being able to put the pieces of data that I have collected, curated, and contextualized together into a story that has a complete beginning, middle, and end. And I want to take a minute, even though this is not the main point of today's webinar, to talk about why telling stories with data is important. As the esteemed communication scholar Walter Fisher argued, another name for Homo sapiens is Homo narrans. Ever since we were young children, we were intrigued by, surrounded by, and socialized through stories. Think about how many times you or a child when you were young or a child in your life now has said, "Can you tell me a story?" Narrative is an incredibly powerful force and one of the most underutilized in data science. So the ability to present data insights as a story will, more than anything else you can do, help close that communication gap between the data and the people the data is intended for. Unfortunately, though, storytelling with data has started to become a very tired buzzword, buzz phrase, that despite its presence is really wildly misunderstood. It's decidedly not about turning presenters into Stephen King or John Grisham. It's about understanding the structure and mechanics of narrative and applying them to data visualization and presentations. And while we don't have time to go into how to craft a story and leverage data visualization as a part of this work, I want to bring it up because I really want to encourage you to look into this literature. It really is more than a buzz phrase. But probably the most visible manifestation of data storytelling is the rise in infographics and the inundation we are facing of data visualizations. They're no longer a cute call out on the front lower right-hand corner on the front page of the USA Today. They're in our emails, they're in our reports, news, sports, regular media, and social media. In fact, just yesterday morning, this was the post from the Business Association from my neighborhood in Philadelphia on their Insta story yesterday morning. I needed another visual for this presentation, so thank you, Mount Airy CDC, but not exactly what I was expecting to see right away. What's funny is now we even have social media accounts dedicated to visualizing the regular media. We have social media channels dedicated to admiring or critiquing data visualizations, such as Data is Beautiful on Reddit. And if that isn't enough, you can now buy infographics as art for your home. So data visualization is everywhere. It's not going anywhere, but what is it? When we start talking about data viz, what are we talking about? Simply put, a data visualization is a graphical depiction of data, such as a dashboard or a graph in a report. In reality, data visualizations present views of data that are designed to answer who, what, where, how, when, and where questions, such as why are our ILL costs and what are our ILL costs and profits by month? Or what services are most in demand for faculty, clinics, journals, and students, and when are these student services most utilized over the course of the year? In other words, data visualizations show a very specific view of a data set. It gives you and users a snapshot of the data intended to answer a specific question. It is not all of the data. It is not all of the work that went into curating that data or analyzing it. It's the information and the knowledge in pictorial form that comes out of spending that time analyzing your data and interpreting it. So why visualize data? For most people, our vision is our dominant processing or intake mechanism. Human beings need pictures. We largely ignore words. Anyone who sent an email knows that. What's more, human beings can only process 3 to 5 things at once in ideal conditions. And let's be honest, how often are we functioning at ideal condition? So there's a lot of benefits that go into visualizing data when you're going up against these types of barriers. In particular, graphic elements are really good at grabbing attention. Research has also shown that visuals can help people digest information because they are meant to be fast and easy to read. It's the direct opposite of a numbers-based table or a spreadsheet. Since visualizations can help people digest information, they can digest more information, which increases the likelihood that some of that information will be retained in their long-term memory. And what's more is visuals have been found to increase the accuracy of information retention and recall. So, for example, I could read this statement to you, have it printed up on a slide during a presentation. In 2005, the United States incarcerated 5 times as many people as most countries in the world, even though our level of crime is comparable to other stable, internally secure, industrialized nations. And then, being an academic, cite my source. So it's all up there on a slide. How much of that are you going to retain? Or are you more likely to take in this graphic while I make the same point? Visual perception research has established that visual information is powerfully and inescapably persuasive in a way that text and speech are not. So why visualize data beyond that? It's also shown, research has also shown that visualizations can increase perceptions of credibility and assessment. Particularly if it's a good visual, it will increase both perceptions of credibility and effectiveness. And so many speakers will lean into this. In fact, during his 2014 State of the Union, President Obama's staff live tweeted charts to illustrate the points he was making as he spoke. I don't know if another president has done that since. But at the same time, credibility can really suffer if a data visualization is difficult to understand. So let's take a look at this delightful COVID-related visual. Because COVID wasn't stressful enough, I really want to take a moment to look at a chart with 10 different colors that I have to go back and forth between a legend and the chart to try and figure out what slice I'm looking at. And then I get to do the math myself to figure out what the pandemic rates are at if I can accurately interpret the percentage that each bit of area represents, which became harder because they cut the middle out of that. So I can't even look at a complete circle to try and piece it together. Most people stopped looking as soon as they saw the color and couldn't figure out what's going on at this and kind of zoned out. So you are taking a risk if you're putting a visualization out there that isn't done well. But when done well, they're a great device for communicating insights into the problems that you're facing, the issues you're struggling with, and the successes you're having. Data viz is really good at helping answer those who, what, where, when, and how questions. Please notice I am not saying why. That comes from the other component that can come from a good data visualization. They can really help facilitate collaborative work. If you have a good visualization that's answering these who, what, where, when, why, when, and how questions, you can have a conversation about why, because a visualization can serve as a common starting point for that discussion. Instead of handing someone a detailed table or a spreadsheet and hope that everybody focuses on the same thing, a data visualization is more productive because everyone's looking at the same set of data. Their attention is being called to the same spot to start the conversation if your data visualization is presented correctly. And that's not something that's going to happen if you just do a big data dump with folks. That's not to say that there are no risks to visualizing data. Many data scientists are wary of visualization because it can really oversimplify the work that went into those analyses and lead people to draw conclusions that ignore nuance or overlook the uncertainty that is inherent in any scientific analysis. But if done well, they really are a way to create meaning and help communicate information that's really important to help organizations make better informed decisions. Obviously, if you opted to spend 2 hours with me over the next few weeks, you have at least been intrigued by the idea of creating a good data visualization to help communicate messages about progress or provide information to really inform organizational management and leadership. So I want to start with a question to all of you to help us work backwards on finding what is good by asking you, what makes you stop looking at graphs or charts? So go into chat real quick if you don't mind and put in some answers. What is it that keeps you from looking at a graph or a chart? What makes you just go, ugh, no? And you all can watch me struggle to get my chat to be seen. There it is. Oh yes, I love these answers. When they're overly complex, there's too many colors, poorly labeled axes. I might challenge you a little bit on that one. When they're too busy and distracting, when they're hard to understand, too much fine print. Oh yes. Too little or too much information. These are all so good points. Too small, too much to look at. Too many wordy explanations. Too meshed. Oh, that's a really good way of putting that. These are all really good points. And I appreciate you throwing those responses in here. And a lot of you are mentioning what are common tripping points that shows up in research. So let's take a look at a few of those real quick. One of the things that you mentioned right away that is very true, we stop looking at graphs or charts when they are overly complex. This chart that I'm about to show you just blows my mind. A Rickroll is supposed to be simple. And yet they used a 3D chart, which distorts data. They used a pie chart, which are really hard to read in a lot of conditions. And at the same time, they're overly precise. Do they really need to go to the hundredths place to tell us how much time is spent informing us that Rick will never give us up? We also stop looking at graphs and charts when there's too much information, no clear salient point, or too many salient points, like this chart. This shows a lot of examples in one. You can make too many points, and at the same time, there isn't a single salient point in this chart. A good takeaway from this presentation is if everything is in bold, nothing is. This many colors, categories with no direction about what is really important, people don't know where to start and they just ignore it at best, or they look at that and they say, are you just trying to bamboozle me with this information? And then your credibility starts to take a ding. People also find charts highly problematic when the creators of data visualizations flout convention. This chart from CNN, yes, I have been known to take photos of my television. The x-axis is supposed to be going backwards here, right? Anybody catch that? We've got October 2018 all the way on the right, but we're starting with April 2021. Maybe this is a mistake, maybe it's intentional manipulation. Regardless, it's a visualization that makes your audience do too many mental gymnastics because now they have to rearrange the data into the way they're used to seeing it. And once or if the x-axis issue is noticed, many probably stopped listening, or like I did, started questioning the motives of the presentation of the data. Unfortunately, flipping the x-axis is not uncommon. Here is a response to the question, how much does it usually cost to get a headstone or monument that was posted on a blog? We also tend to stop looking at visualizations when they use bad data. Sometimes bad data can be really hard to spot. Other times you have to wonder how sometimes it made it to print. Question of the day, what should cost less, a gallon of gas or a gallon of milk? Yes, no. What you need to be focused on when you are engaging with creating data visualizations is information design, not styling. Creating a good data visualization isn't just picking colors and fonts or coming up with an aesthetic for the chart. That's styling. It is an important part of design, but it's by no means the most important part. Information design is really about understanding how to create and edit visuals to focus an audience and distill ideas. This is particularly important if you're trying to increase stakeholder awareness for your law library's contributions. You've really got to think about that message you're trying to impart. And currently, many law library communications are focusing on how good the library is. Typically, this is done by focusing on visualizations with information about library inputs, like the number of reference service hours offered, and information on outputs, like the number of questions answered at the reference desk over the course of the year. I did a quick search for law library annual reports, and I found a lot of images right away. Please know I'm not trying to call any library out. None of these are by any means unique. There were all sorts of these by the numbers sections that look at library inputs and outputs, and they came in many forms and on many different topics. And of course, this numbers approach is not limited to law libraries by any means. Here's just 3 real quick infographics that I found. One from NPR, one from Orbitz, and one about the Olympics. And information infographics like these are getting a really bad reputation with us data nerds. One leading scholar in the field, Dr. Stephanie Aldergreen, goes as far as calling them data puke. And that's because these types of graphics are essentially unrelated random bullet points in a hidden table format that uses fancy fonts and colors. And keep in mind, human beings really struggle with tables. They're hard for our brains to process. And that's true even when they are orderly and very well presented, like this one from King County Law Library's annual report. But unfortunately, tables are hard to look at and efficiently draw a conclusion. And that's why so many people have swung over to these infographic type approaches. But when you layer in a table format with random numbers, your audience's working memory completely overloads because they can't find a cohesive thread or story. Cognitively, we can't do much with the information presented by the number infographics. They may grab your attention for a second or get someone to look at a single square. There were 26 floats in the 2016 Macy's Thanksgiving Parade. So what? Is that a lot? Is that more than last year? Should I be impressed? How does that stack up against the number of floats in the Rose Bowl parade? So when you start showing isolated numbers that even though they've been collected, they don't feel curated, and they're certainly lacking context, it's really hard to advance people towards knowledge. Context is really part of how we get meaning, and people are instinctively always trying to make meaning. So help them. Tell the story within these infographics. Theming your infographics to a certain topic and using them to help initiate a conversation is a really powerful approach. Here are two infographics my office created when I was working in the when I was leading research for the student affairs at the University of Michigan. We used survey data that had been collected for years to create focused discussions about how do we develop programming around civic engagement, or how do we see what impact student identity may have on how they engage with university life. We didn't just email these out. These were given out as part of a retreat to start a conversation and inform a discussion and facilitate some decision making. We had a clear, defined purpose within a set context. Looking back at these now, 5 years later, there's a lot of tweaks I would love to go back in time to make, but it's a start. There's one clearly identified theme per infographic. We were trying to build a story. So essentially what I'm asking you to do is try and transform your messages. Libraries need to move the conversation from how good the library is to what good the law library does or enables others to do. And you can see glimmers of this move in some annual reports. Now, here's an early attempt by the Olmsted County Law Library in Minnesota. They used narrative to explain what good the library does or enables others to do off of most of these data points. Unfortunately, though, heavy narrative isn't always ideal. So that's where you can start to transform the message through graphics by giving context through charts. You want to give people the context so they can start making their own meaning and see the meaning of the message you are trying to convey. This can be done by making comparisons against your own history, an internal goal, or an external benchmark. Those are three great sources for an initial comparison. I think someone's speaking and they might have their microphone unmuted. So if people could check that real quick, I'm hearing a side conversation. So while we do only have an hour and a half left, I want to spend some time going through how to visually present data to avoid some of these situations by talking about the data visualization process. We're going to cover the first steps in this process today, and then we will spend time with the end of the process and doing some tips on Excel predominantly on how to make some of these visualizations yourself. So in the data visualization process, there are 5 general steps, and it starts with step 0, and that's collect good data. Law libraries need to be collecting good data, and collecting data for data's sake is useless. Even if everything you collect is good, you are not going to use or visualize everything. It's just not going to happen. Don't hoard data. It's an ever increasing problem. In fact, IBM estimated in 2016 that 85% of the data organizations collect is irrelevant or should be deleted and could be wasting companies the equivalent of over $3.1 trillion every year. Data hoarding problems and identifying useful data is an issue for another webinar series. But to get you started, here are 4 questions to ask yourself if you're starting with good data. Are the data that you are collecting through a metric systematically being collected and consistently applied? Does everybody understand how to classify that type of reference question when they enter it into the database? Does your gate counter truly work that it's catching every single library user, and are you subtracting out staff? Does that metric give you data that is relevant and useful? Can you make a decision with it? Or is it something that a stakeholder really needs to know? Does the metric measure outcomes, not output, outcomes in a meaningful way? And does the metric align with the goals of the service that's being examined, the program, the law library? Does it align with the law school's goals or the broader institutional mission? You should be able to say yes to all 4 questions for all of the data you collect. Once you have your good data, it's time to start visualizing it. And the first thing you need to do is figure out what is the point of your visualization. No point, no picture. And the point is never to show your data. You want to answer this question. What is the point I'm trying to make? And you want to write it down as a complete sentence that gives insight to the data. That insight is what drives the visualization that you will choose. And that complete sentence will actually come in really handy when it's time to write the title of your graph. A key step of data visualization, step 2, that is often glossed over, is taking the time to really analyze or consider your audience for the visual. This is important because the persuasive power of a visual and an audience's ability to understand a visual are not fixed. A visual's effectiveness can change based on a lot of factors, including prior knowledge, data literacy, even mood. A bored, agitated, tired audience won't make sense of your charts and the message that you're trying to convey the same way as an audience that's engaged and happy and generally positively primed. We know this instinctively, right? We don't schedule 3-hour meetings over lunch and not offer food. So when you're trying to analyze your audience, some things that you want to consider. Who are the potential audiences? You can think about this in terms of stakeholder groups like administration, library users, alumni, but you can also think about this in terms of their relationship to the issue or process under investigation. In other words, are they just interested or are they responsible for what's going on? If they're just interested, it's more of an FYI, but if they're responsible, your visual transforms to becoming more of a point of advocacy. Another helpful break in terms of what type of audience you're working with is this going to the decision makers or the action takers? Are you advocating for a decision to be made, like give us more money in our budget? Or are you convincing people that they need to get on board with the decision that's already being made or been made? You want to think about your audience's needs, not just what you want to tell them, but what are their burning questions? What are they wondering about? What are their key worries? You want to describe their data needs and the level of detail they need. Do they really need the disaggregation between every type of subscription or resource you have in your collection? Or is just a high-level look good enough? Along those lines, how sophisticated are they with data? Not only the type of statistic you are using, but also what's their handle on library ease? Are you going to have to explain the difference between a title and a volume? Those explanations and that level of need is going to dictate how much narrative you're going to have to wrap around your visual, or how much explaining you're going to have to do as you present your visual. You need to think about what format or channel you're communicating with them. Literally write it down. List out the software and the platforms and the formats. There's a really big difference between a physical piece of paper that is a one-page summary handed out ahead of a presentation and being emailed a link to the 30-page annual report that's stored in your institutional repository. What's your timing of that communication? Literal timing. Are you trying to catch someone's attention and give them data, and you're the third presentation in 5 back-to-back meetings? Is it the end of the semester when people are trying to grade and wrap up all other responsibilities? The amount of distractions, the amount of things that are draining people's attention is going to shape how much information you can pack into that visual. The less they can focus, the less you're going to be able to put in there. So really thinking about a lot of aspects about your audience beyond, oh, this is going to go to my dean. Now it's time to start picking the chart you're going to use based on your audience's needs and what they need to keep listening or engaging with your message, as well as what your takeaway message is. These are the 2 things that are really going to drive your chart selection. But before I tell you what chart to pick, I want to start with what types of charts to avoid altogether. First principle, area is really hard for people to interpret accurately. So avoid charts that rely on interpreting area. So here is a fake chart I made that shows theoretical downloads of articles written by law faculty over 5 days to help compare the SSRN and a library's IR. And while this is a visually attractive chart because it really is colorful, area charts are really hard to interpret. And this becomes particularly true when some of the data is hidden. Researchers have found that human beings are just much better at judging length than area. And this is probably why column charts and bar charts are so ubiquitous. Here's the exact same data presented as a column chart. Now you can actually see what is happening to IR downloads that's hidden behind SSRN. Pie charts, which also involve area, also regularly produce errors in interpretation. People also deal better with length than they do angles. So if we look at this chart on reference questions by patron types, who do you think relies on reference services more at this mythical law library, faculty or the public? And in case you haven't spotted it yet, at the bottom, public is green and the faculty is orange. Can you even tell a difference? And this is where people really do struggle with angles. So we move to a bar chart because once again, people deal with length much better than they deal with angles. The worst type of charts are those that ask people to interpret area, but also ask them to interpret volume or involve curvature. It becomes particularly problematic when all of these features get combined. I do not know exactly what this chart is trying to depict, which is a whole nother problem, and we'll talk about the importance of writing a good title or headline for your chart. But given the bottle shape, let's imagine that this graph is showing the percent of milk that is consumed within a country versus exported for 5 different countries. Looking at this chart, would you be able to identify which country consumes the most? I'll give you a second to look at it before I tell you the answer. Apparently, the US was larger on whatever issue this is actually depicting, but between the pattern and the use of volume with curves, it's really impossible to tell. And this is part of why people advise really strongly against the use of 3D charts. When you create a 3D chart, the data is automatically distorted. So another big takeaway, no more 3-dimensional charts. And for example, if we look at this 3D pie chart from the city of Minneapolis, if you couldn't see the labels, which appears larger, police, parks, or general services? From this angle, do public works and other long-term liabilities really look the same size? Not so much, and that's because of the way the data has been manipulated or distorted to get this 3D effect. It's also highly problematic when people opt to use shading rather than color in their charts. Shading can create really terrible optical illusions for users. 3D texture insanity ensued here when the Austin American-Statesman created this chart. This is the result of combining shading with 3D distortions of data. So the takeaway here is use color, not shading, when creating charts. Even if things will be printed in black and white, use color. So when you are picking your chart, like I said before, you want to pick your chart based on the key piece of information you are trying to show. Don't forget to look for ways to give that information context, either through written explanations or making comparisons. Keep in mind, we are going to avoid area charts, 3D charts. But other than that, there are a lot of really unique, interesting charts out there. If you spend some time in Excel, Canva, Google Sheets, you'll really see all sorts of ways to visualize data. The ones I'm about to go through were picked for a few different reasons. They might be really easy to make. They provide context very easily. They reduce cognitive load, or they lower how much knowledge your audience needs to understand the chart. Remember though, rarely will a visualization work by itself. They're good conversation starters. They don't replace conversation. So when you want your audience to know and remember a number, you can use a big single number. This can also be a big single percent. The caveat with this type of data visualization is you can really only use this approach once in a document because it loses its impact. But don't shy away from just putting a really big number as an attention getter, especially when you wrap it with a title for your chart that actually reads more like a headline. It tells you what you're looking at without describing what you're looking at. This is the number of law faculty who like document delivery. A lot of people will drift over to a donut chart for trying to remember a single percent instead of using the single big number. Essentially, Donut charts are pie charts with a hole cut in the center. It's essentially a visual ornament around your single big number. So I apparently lost the word desks on my headline, but this is the percent of students who prefer standing desks. Another great way to work with percents when there are less than 3 percentages or less than 3 numbers is to use an icon array. These are also called pictographs. Icon arrays really display one shape repeatedly. Sometimes the shapes are altered, typically by color, to show a proportion. These are a lot easier to interpret than a pie chart. And so the mental energy for interpretation goes towards memory instead, even if you're asking them to convert the image of 1 donut to represent 10. So each donut here represents 10 donuts, but the students preferred chocolate, and we gave away a heck of a lot of them during our journal article citation-a-thon. I know I've been railing against pie charts, so it's kind of funny that I'm throwing up a pie chart as an option, and they really are an option under certain conditions. They tend to work best when one of the slices is very small or very large, and it's that proportion change that you are trying to emphasize. So it goes back to your message. Is it about you understanding the distribution of the data, which you can get better with an icon array, or is it about drawing people's attention to how lopsided the data is? So here in this fake budget data, you come out strong with what you want them to take away. Law library personnel are a fiscally undervalued resource. Subtitle, I want personnel expenditures to be reevaluated, because only 4% is going to personnel and 89% is going to collections. 4% versus 7% on operations. So you've got to think about what's the takeaway. Pie charts are great when you're trying to show that the proportions are out of kilter. If you are trying to show multiple percentages, you're going to want to use something more like a stacked bar or a stacked column. These are much better than a pie because it removes the angle. Remember, people are much better at dealing with the length, and they work particularly well when there are more than 3 categories. These charts are a vertical column or a horizontal bar that's divided into subgroups. Each subgroup, which is colored differently, represents a proportion that makes up the whole. And again, instead of describing the data, like the distribution of seating in the law library, this is the takeaway. We renovated the space to transition seating to facilitate collaboration. And you can see that by how many study rooms we have and how many open tables. Another really great thing to use when you're working with multiple percentages, particularly budget data, is a tree map. Tree maps take the change the smaller boxes proportionately based on size. So if we were to get out our calculators and rulers and measure the size of the area of the box of the United States, it would be 49% of this entire box. And the nice thing that you can do with a tree map is you can play with color to help highlight how things hook together. So here, United States is in blue, European countries are in red, Asian countries are identified in gray. And our headline says, hey, we're well positioned to support comparative law scholars focused on Europe and Asia. We need additional funds if you want to bring in scholars focused on Africa and South America, because notice our collection has nothing, because that equals 100%. Seeing how data changes or doesn't change over time is another great way to give context to your data to help create knowledge. And line graphs are probably the most common way to show change over time. And this is where data points are connected by lines, and they are great for two data series that have 3 or more correct connected points. You can also use these to project where you think things are going to head in the future. You'll notice here that what I was doing with color is I tried to make what I want to stand out the bright color, so total, because I don't really care about the modality. It's interesting, you can see a flip-flop around the time of COVID between in-person and digital presentations, but it's really the total demand that exists for library presentations that I wanted to emphasize with this chart. If I wanted to emphasize the flip-flop in modality, everything would be light blue except for the call out around FY21 on these two data points. We turn that into orange and probably put a note there. And we'll talk about how to draw attention to different aspects of charts more next time. I did want to point out a design element, even though I was using a cartoon here. When you're working with line charts, it is really important that if you're moving towards projected, that you change your line type from a solid to a dash to indicate you're not psychic. There's a chance you aren't exactly right with how this is going to go, as that poor turkey is about to learn. You just do that little visual trick there to help people understand. If you don't have as many points in time that you're comparing, if you're only comparing 2 values to show increase or decrease, slope graphs are a great way to go. Slope graphs are a set of lines through 2 points that encode data through the angle of the slope, but you use data labels, so it doesn't have as much work for your audience on that angle. And again, using color to show where there's an anomaly in the overall data. I also really love a good dot plot, also called the Cleveland dot plot. These are really neat and clean alternatives to a slope graph that encodes the data through the position of dots on the scale to take out angle. They rely on distance instead, so they can be easier for libraries, for readers to digest. These can be really flexible graphs because you can compare 2 values across numerous categories. And they're also a nice visual change from a bar chart. You know, we get a lot of bar charts, so here's a good way to swap it up with change it up with the dot plot. When you want to show how categories are changing over time, a stacked column can be really good, particularly if one of those categories is very small. So let's pretend you did a study of all the people working in your library. You asked them to record what time they went to bed every day for 5 months. You could craft a stacked column chart where the teal are the number of nights a month staff on average went to bed before 10 p.m. And then the gray is the number of nights they went to bed after 10 p.m. Where the chart column as a whole is the number of nights in that month. So October has 31 days, so does December, but it's still overall the same space given to October and December as November, which only has 30 days. So it helps see proportion of the whole, and you can see those fluctuations. And here that our staff are least rested at the start and the end of the semester. Sometimes showing the cumulative effect of change over time can be a little tricky. And so waterfall or flying brick charts are really nice to do this work. They show how percents change over time without having to do as much percent change math. And then you can see the overall trend without getting hung up on oh, it was only a 38% increase versus the year that we went down by 10%. It helps you see that trajectory as well as the size of some of these leaps in demand from the clinical faculty. Another way to show changes in percentage over time is with a deviation bar graph. This is a bar graph with bars going in the negative or positive directions to show what change has occurred. This is really helpful when you want to give a sense of like how much is growing and how much is decreasing as opposed to overall trajectory over time. So here would be the change where demand is increasing and decreasing on an ILL service. As I mentioned earlier, making comparisons are also a great way to start talking about content. The chart most typically used to compare data in a visualization is the side-by-side column. In these charts, data is compared by looking at the relative size of one chart to the column to the one that's next. But you want to be careful with these because having too many columns can make the chart unwieldy. So if you are comfortable with putting the comparisons overlapping because you know that there's a relationship between the two data points, an overlapping bar chart is a really nice alternative to showing differences. So here, how much we budgeted versus how much we spent in different categories. And I'm going to pause here for today. And next time we will finish up talking about some of the different charts that are less well known when you're making comparisons or when you're trying to add context like showing targets. And then we'll start going into these really fine details about when do you have access labels versus when do you use data labels, or how do you write a compelling headline to your graph. I appreciate you hanging in there for so much context before getting into the meat of this. I know it can be a lot to think about and it's a lot of information coming at you very quickly. I do want to mention real quick, since we are in data land, that the NELLCO symposium is coming up and the requests for proposals have gone out. So if you have some data and some insights that you would like to share with your colleagues using some really cool new data visualizations, this could be a great place to do that. So we invite your proposals for that. If any of you have questions before we come together next time, I have been copied on all of the emails that went out with the invite, but you're welcome to email me. I am the Karel. I'm sorry, that is not correct. This is the one organization where I do not have that address. It's just my name, amanda.carol@nellco.org. You're welcome to send me notes or questions. If you would like copies of slides, I will also send those out at the end of the full series. So you will have all of this information in one spot. So thank you again for joining.